Okay, it is 2:03. I believe in being a person of my word, so we will get started. Before I kick us off, just for folks who are still trickling in, just want to reiterate, if you have questions or thoughts that come up throughout our conversation, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom box to submit questions that you may have, and we will use about the last 5 to 7 minutes of this discussion to try to answer as many of your questions as possible. But welcome everyone to state courts, why they're important and why you should become one. In recent years, we've seen and heard a lot more about state courts, certainly after cases like Dobbs, which I'm sure many, if not all of you know, overturned the fundamental right to abortion and other concerning cases coming out of federal court specifically. More and more buzz has turned to state courts and their importance. In response, we've also seen some really, really exciting and incredible individuals and attorneys being elevated to state court judgeships in some really critical areas. So I'm super excited to be in this space today with you all to dive deeper into the significance of our state courts and what the pathway to these judgeships looks like, particularly for those here today who've been curious and or interested in starting that journey for yourselves. And so for this conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by Eddie Davenport, Kadida Kenner, and Vasu Abhiraman. Before we get started, I just want to quickly introduce our three wonderful panelists a little more. So I will start with Kadida. Kadida serves as the co-chair of Why Courts Matter Pennsylvania, an advocacy campaign seeking to protect the independence of our state and federal courts and educate the electorate about their importance. She's the CEO of the New Pennsylvania Project and the New Pennsylvania Project Education Fund. The New Pennsylvania Project's primary focus is to civically engage, register, mobilize, and empower often ignored constituents, especially the youth and communities of color in rural, urban, and suburban Pennsylvania to transform and expand the electorate in the Commonwealth. Up next, Vasu is the Helen Rosenthal Senior Counsel for the Building the Bench program at Alliance for Justice. In this role, he serves as a dedicated advocate for diversity and inclusion in both the federal and state judiciary, working collaboratively with a coalition of organizations to identify and recruit potential candidates for the bench. And last but certainly not least, we have Eddie Davenport, who is the project director for the Buckeye Justice Forum, facilitating the recruitment, vetting, training, and mentorship of progressive judicial candidates, and offers education and networking opportunities with the goal of molding a progressive judiciary throughout Ohio. So I'm excited, as I've already said. I think you all are in for a treat. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and just get us started with, I think, the most obvious, but I think a really, really important question that I just want to pose to all of you, which is just why are state courts so important? What's the value of organizing around state courts and their vacancies? I think in our work, we are kind of steeped in this conversation. And so this kind of feels like a no-brainer question. But for some folks on the call, and a lot of lay people across the country, state courts, aren't the most glamorous or the most talked about topic when we think about the law. And so just to kind of lay some of that foundation, I'd love to hear more from all of you if you are interested in answering that particular question about why state courts are so important. And I won't cold call on anyone first. I'll just let whoever wants to start. Thank you.
I'll jump in here. Good afternoon, everybody. State courts are important for all the things that we care about, right? So if you are an advocate of economic justice, judicial justice, if you're an advocate of trying to have fair funding in public schools, if you're an advocate of abortion access, state courts matter because all the issues we care about are typically arbitrated in some type of courtroom. And so if you, whatever you care about, whatever wakes you up in the morning and you're fighting for and advocating for, add the courts to that because they're going to run through the courts.
So I'll jump in here to echo what Kadida was saying. 95% of all cases are heard in state courts. And when it comes to some of the most important issues, like Tristan was mentioning, the Dobbs abortion issue, you have state courts either codifying that right to abortion or eliminating it. And it can vary depending on what state you're in. Sometimes state constitutions can be much more progressive than the US Constitution and US laws. So you can have situations where there's a map that's drawn that tries to pack and crack Black voters in a state. And a claim under the Voting Rights Act, federal law, may fail. But then a claim under a state constitution may actually succeed. So states can be kind of the laboratories of democracy and at the vanguard of expanding our rights. And again, 95% of cases come through state courts. So you're talking about making a difference, that's 19 out of every 20.
Yeah, I echo what both my colleagues said before. It really is on so many of the issues that we care about when it comes to justice and protecting rights and lessening the impacts of the system. We get a lot of focus on the federal courts. A lot of attention is drawn news-wise and energy-wise to what's happening with the federal judiciary. But, Vasu hit the nail right on the head. Most of this ends up, right down the street from you in your county in one of these courthouses. A lot of the impacts, positive or negative, they happen within those courthouses. And within the three branches of government, the judiciary is often the forgotten child, particularly state courts. And so for much of what we are hoping to do within the justice reform realm and, creating a more just and fair system, if we're looking to have the maximum impact, it is our state courts actually where we can have the most impact with what's going on around us. And depending on the state in which you live and their selections process for these judges, you can actually have a direct impact on the people who are making these decisions. So often the most overlooked position in all of elected government, but arguably the most impactful.
Yeah, and Vasu, you said something just about states being the labs for democracy, making me think how we have still even continued to see after Dobbs, a lot of states, whether through ballot initiatives or through their courts enshrining, things like abortion rights in their state constitutions. And so just thinking about how state courts have a really, really huge role to play in enforcing some of those laws that are passed, especially after really, really egregious and concerning things happen at the federal level. I think it's just all the more reason to think about the role that state courts can play in this arena. But I want to just kind of pivot to talking about some examples of state court organizing. I think it's always fun to talk about these things in the abstract. And I'm so glad, especially to have Kadida and Eddie here for this question specifically. But thinking just about what and where are some examples of state court organizing resulting in seeing more pro-people, professionally diverse judges on the bench. And so, Kadida, I know your organization is a great example of groups doing this type of work, and organizing. Also, Eddie, a lot of the pipeline work that you do. So I'd love to hear either or both of you. Also, Vasu, you're welcome to jump in. Just talk more about some of the wins you've been able to see in your states, just in other states across the country, leading some of the work that you've been doing in your capacity.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say we've been doing a lot of work around a reflective democracy here in Pennsylvania. We're one of, I guess it's 8 states now that we elect all of our judges for our appellate courts, intermediate appellate courts, in a statewide way. And for us, Pennsylvania had an issue with diversity, and I'm talking racial diversity on our appellate court benches. Of 31, just in 2020, we only had 1 person of color sitting on our appellate courts in Pennsylvania. So that's 3%, where Pennsylvania is, according to the last census, is about 25% folks of color. And since then, 4 years since then, it has increased. We're now up to almost 10% of our judges on the appellate courts here in Pennsylvania identify as belonging to a community of color. 3 Black women in particular sit on Pennsylvania appellate courts now. And so there's work to do. And so for an organization like ours who believes in a representative democracy, that we believe in not gerrymandering folks out of districts. We believe in having elected officials who represent their communities, professional diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity. And so for us, it was really important for folks to recognize that most Pennsylvanians have no idea who these judges are. They've never seen their faces. And if they have seen their face, it was either maybe the best day of their life or the worst day of their life in seeing a judge. And so for them to actually, through conversations, community conversations, to see this is what your Supreme Court looks like. This is what your Commonwealth Court looks like. This is what your Superior Court looks like. What do you see that's different about these judges, or what's very similar about these judges? Because when we know that the average, layperson here, doesn't know too much about what it is the courts do. And so actually hearing what kind of cases do they hear, making it real for them in their lives so they actually care about going out and casting a ballot for them in an odd year election. So for us in Pennsylvania, it's just really important about representation, a reflective democracy, and providing that civic education so people actually know what it is these judges do.
A lot of what Kadida said there rings true for Ohio as well. Similarly, we are a state where every judicial seat is elected, and we do find with left to status quo selections processes, the benches end up usually being elderly, male, white. Many come from a corporate or a prosecutor's background, and it really does load the court to have one very similar view of what justice is and what the responsibility of that system is. And for us, it was very shocking in Ohio. Our judicial work started in earnest late 2017, early 2018, to kind of look around the state to try to find opportunities for success. And what we really found was, an electorate in the state that really didn't understand its judiciary that well. No one was giving the attention and putting thought into a lot of the selections processes. And the status quo just reinforced, the diversity or the lack of diversity on the bench. One thing we have looked to really hammer on here in Ohio is professional diversity. Like we said, the prosecutor to bench pipeline is a very real thing, and particularly around urban centers. Unless there was active organizing work, which there was none, around these seats, we saw a bench that was not representative of the population that was appearing in front of it or that it was serving. So we have worked very hard to make it a more approachable thing to run for judge, whether that be sharing of education on how to run for judge, best practice, creating and landscaping, the space within localities, geographies of Ohio, where people who have backgrounds that we think need to be represented, public defenders, people who work with legal aid, where they can be heard, and we can, really push education of what the justice system could be, where its shortcomings are right now, and kind of that lack of balance. So our work, we've seen more progressive candidates, public defenders, get elected in all corners kind of our state, even though there is a very large conservative swing in Ohio and a lot of places, whether, from Cincinnati to Columbus to Cleveland and many other cities. We've seen a much more diverse and people-minded judiciary be elected through some of the organizing work.
Yeah, and I just want to also highlight a lot of really cool things that have happened recently across the country. I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with some of these folks who've been either nominated or elected to state courts. I think Judge Janet Protasewicz out of Wisconsin being elected to the Wisconsin Supreme Court is an example of just, the results that can come out of some really great advocacy and organizing. I'd also point out Judge Allison Riggs, who was appointed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and she'll be running this year for a full term. There was some really great organizing happening by the Court New York Deserves Coalition recently that actually defeated the nomination of a particular judge, Hector LaSalle, and in turn got now Chief Judge Rowan Wilson elevated to that seat. And so there's just been a lot of, really, really great work, I think, happening around state courts that I think will, hopefully be the make or break that we see in a lot of the outcomes coming out of some of these courts in some really, really crucial areas. But Vasu, I want to just turn to you quickly, because we're even seeing some of that sweeping transformation happen on federal benches throughout the country. And you also work on diversifying our federal judiciary. So do you see any parallels between advocacy aimed at diversifying federal and state judiciaries? And should this also send a motivating message to students and attorneys dedicated to public interest who haven't necessarily seen a pathway to becoming a judge for themselves?
Thanks, Tristan. There are certainly many parallels between the federal judiciary and the state judiciary. The main parallel that I would name for everyone is the need for diversity in both realms, professionally and demographically. Eddie was talking about the prosecutor to judge pipeline that has existed in the federal judiciary for quite a while. And the federal judiciary, demographically and professionally, it still needs a lot of work. I will commend the work of the White House during this administration for making great strides in that area. But when you look at things like reproductive justice attorneys, environmental justice attorneys, labor lawyers, folks who've actually litigated LGBTQ law cases, for example. We still don't have too many judges in the federal judiciary with those backgrounds. And unfortunately, that need is ever present for state courts as well. If you look at state Supreme Courts, judicial diversity is definitely lacking. Nearly 2 out of every 5 justices on state Supreme Courts carry a prosecutorial background, speaking to that pipeline. Only about 1 out of 10 carries a background as a public defender. Out of 345 justices nationwide, not even 25 carry a background in civil rights, and barely 3% of state Supreme Court justices have backgrounds in civil rights outside of government practice. Demographically, for state Supreme Courts, it's the rare justice that comes from a Hispanic, Asian, or Native American community. These are areas that the federal judiciary still needs a lot of work as well. So in terms of a need that needs to be met, that is the biggest parallel between the two. When it comes to differences, the gatekeepers who are making the decisions for who gets nominated on the federal courts, you have the White House, you have home state senators, and then you have home state senators are relying upon in-state to vet and screen candidates. That's kind of the role, the holy trinity or unholy trinity, if you will, of the federal judiciary. On the state level, the gatekeepers can vary. We've already mentioned that you might have an election, right, which is completely different. Federal judges don't have to run for election. And then gatekeepers, when it comes to folks actually being nominated or directly appointed to the bench, instead of the White House, you'll often have governor's offices, and you'll have to figure out what the governor is relying upon, who their chief counsel is, and those people can differ and differ in viewpoint, differ in process, and you'll have to figure that out in order to make a difference in the process. I will say often with the state process too, things can often be kind of fully baked behind the scenes before things are announced to the public. So you really have to put in the work to make sure that you at least have some connections on the ground who can get some of this intel in order for you to actually make a difference when the decisions are actually being made. So for the federal process, it's more or less predictable in terms of what happens when. The state process can vary so much, and you have to understand from people on the ground what's actually happening.
I think that's a perfect segue into my next question. We've kind of talked about the different ways to become a state court judge. Obviously, the major two just being elections and appointments. Vasu, you just kind of went over some of the stuff as it relates to appointments. But for those on the call who are not familiar with the processes to become a judge, as you were just kind of alluding to, Vasu, like it can be really technical, it can vary, it can be unpredictable. But I would also love to hear from Kadida and or Eddie about the election side of things. If y'all can just give a brief overview of what's usually required, and in some cases, what like concrete examples can give additional boosts to people, whether they're in the process of seeking an appointment or seeking an elected seat out.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in on this one. So within the state of Ohio, specifically, there are practice requirements and age requirements to be able to run for judge, some residency requirements. So of course you have to live within the state. You cannot be at the age 70 or over at the time that you are sworn in for your current term. You could be over, but you can't be resworn in again. And you have to practice for a full 6 years within the state before running for judge. And that's it. That is, the hardline requirements of what it takes to run for judge. So, we see a lot here, of what kind of boosts and kind of what the informal requirements are. Ohio is a very interesting state. Partisan affiliation on the ballot has become a very big issue here over the last few years, where for the longest time, these were nonpartisan races, meaning that no judge, no judicial candidate would have a party identifier next to their name on the ballot. Until recently, until about two and a half years ago. Now our intermediate appellate and Supreme Court races do have a D and an R next to their name. However, all the trial court races, whether that be municipal level or common pleas level, do not, which makes for very interesting dynamics with how parties play into the selections process here. And also within the state of Ohio, for all of these seats, even if you are nonpartisan, you still have to go through a partisan primary. So we actually are gearing up in March in Ohio for 2024. Primaries around the corner, meaning every judge is declaring right now what primary that they are running in. So there are requirements, informal requirements around like what actually does bolster your chances of, getting seated within a specific area. A lot of things that we see tend to be really strong for any judicial candidate. People like trial and courtroom experience, people who really know what's going on within the building where they're going to operate. So trial experience matters a lot. And we're seeing a lot more that experience pro bono work and work with projects such as the Innocence Project. Ohio Justice and Policy Center here does a lot of work with wrongful convictions. People have an eye on a little bit more now how the system can fail in achieving justice, and that does cut across some interesting lines in different groups. And so those work in those areas tends to boost people because it speaks to their values and wanting justice, to go back and correct any errors that may have been made. But no, those are, there's the hard requirements, and then there's kind of, everything else that kind of colors in the detail for a candidate that can portray them, to the public and make it more likely to gain support.
I don't have too much more to add to what Eddie just spoke on. We have similar age requirements, residency requirements. What we do have in Pennsylvania that's unique is that we have magisterial courts. And, we call them the lower courts, but when you can sentence somebody up to 3 to 5 years in prison, it's not that low. And these magisterial judges actually do not need to have passed the bar to become a magisterial judge in Pennsylvania. And it was, we talk about a pipeline. Traditionally, historically, magisterial judges in Pennsylvania come from law enforcement. They're police officers. And this is their opportunity to retire and have this type of job in retirement, is becoming a magisterial judge. So that is something that happens here in Pennsylvania. And I'll say that, again, we are a state in which all of our judges are elected in partisan elections. So there's going to be a D and an R behind these names. And our retention voting is getting after 10 years of serving on the bench, you're up for retention vote. At that time, that is a nonpartisan vote. You won't see a D and R behind your name for retention voting in Pennsylvania. And it's based upon your record. If you performed your duties as judge for 10 years, then you performed your duty as judge for 10 years, and we're not going to see the D and R behind your name. The last thing I'll mention in terms of Pennsylvania, we were coming off of a very crucial Pennsylvania Supreme Court race that just happened last year. We made lots of national news in regards to that. And you could say that that race was pretty politicized, and that we had judges taking a stance on where they would fall on abortion access. And so that's kind of different than what we've seen historically with judicial elections, where judges will say, I may hear a case regarding that, so I'm not going to speak to this. And here in Pennsylvania, we are very much wanting to know where you stand on an issue if we're going to vote for you in an election.
Jump in to add a quick plug-in for our State Courts Hub. I just shared a link into the chat. If you check it out, Kadida and Eddie were talking about the different methods for getting on the bench. Well, for state Supreme Courts, we have this clickable map. You see Pennsylvania is listed as partisan election, Utah, gubernatorial appointment, Georgia, where I'm from, nonpartisan election. So again, it varies from state to state. And if you want a quick overview of how it all works, check out our State Courts Hub.
We love a handy dandy resource. I was just going to say, because I didn't know that was a thing in Pennsylvania where there could be judges who have not passed the bar. And so I was definitely going to plug for folks who are not in Pennsylvania or Ohio to definitely check out the requirements as it relates to your state or states that folks who you think would be great judges and might be interested in. And so there is this awesome resource you can direct yourself or others to. So thanks for sharing that, Vasu. As a reminder, before we keep going, if folks have questions that come up, feel free to use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any and all of your questions, and we will try to get to them near the end of the program. But Eddie, I want to just kind of pivot to you. Your organization, Buckeye Justice Forum, does a lot of this great pipeline work that, we've kind of alluded to throughout this conversation. And, I think it's really, really important, especially for folks on the call who are thinking about state court judgeships or other judgeships and just don't know how to get started, to just stress the usefulness of bigger infrastructure systems that help to develop and support a pipeline of really, really wonderful individuals interested in becoming judges. So would love to hear you share a little bit more about that work that you're doing and how you've seen that pay off specifically in Ohio.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We are like incredibly proud of kind of the academy structures and the work that we've done on pipelining in Ohio. It can not be the most friendly place for pro people side of things to organize and try to recruit candidates, or I should say attorneys, to consider running for judge. And there's a lot of reasons why people won't, consider running for judge. Some of it is the feeling that, you are up against something insurmountable. In Ohio, we have specific judicial canons that the Supreme Court requires all judges and judicial candidates to follow. And even as a judicial candidate, if you do not abide by those requirements, it will get tacked onto your bar license even after you're done running. So people get very concerned over what you can and can't do running for judge, and it keeps a lot of people from running. So we saw that as a major hurdle around general information and knowledge gaps around how to run for judge within the state of Ohio, and then just doing some landscape analysis of who tends to become a judge in various areas of the state. I talked a little bit about the status quo before. There are very well-worn pathways of kind of who gets to step up next for a lot of these seats. So our project, Buckeye Justice Forum, kind of started in the southwest corner of the state with just a local organizing project out of Hamilton County, which is the Cincinnati area in the southwest corner of the state, really trying to solve that knowledge gap, to close that knowledge gap, to get a very qualified, diverse set of attorneys to consider running for office. We gave them the skills and training they needed to be able to full bore enter the space and know what they were doing. And from 2018 to 2020, we saw an absolute sea change in the local courts in the southwest corner of the state, talking about these issues, bringing a lot of the experience to the voters. I can't harp enough just the education level of talking about the courts with the public. People don't really know what's going on within those courts because most people don't need to appear in front of them. So we were able to kind of create a little bit of an organizing movement here of people all of a sudden having their eyes open to this. And we were able to start spreading that into a statewide training program where we applied some of the learnings and best practices from one corner of the state to a lot of other areas where we found similar things to be true. A lot of well-worn pathways, kind of a lack of attention from an electorate or just the news and the awareness of people of what was going on, and wanting to put a little bit more elbow grease into getting better people to step up and run. And the impacts of that have been felt dramatically across Ohio. Last year we did have a constitutional amendment to enshrine abortion rights in our Constitution. But up until that point, our state legislature aggressively attacked those rights for years leading up to it. And access to abortion and medical care surrounding that was only able to exist because of some of the judges that were elected in Southwest Ohio that were willing to take a look at the kind of the insidious attacks that were coming out of the legislature, which were overreaching and horrible, and strike those down. It was one judge out of southwest corner of the state that kept abortion accessible to Ohioans up until that amendment passing. So honestly, the judiciary, you end up it's the last line of defense. And so it doesn't always attract, again, all the attention and energy, but organizing around it and, putting some elbow grease behind it, you never know when you're going to need someone to step up, where a case is going to come. And so we pipeline in every urban center around the state of Ohio. We're starting to increase to kind of more of the collar counties around a lot of those areas to, hopefully provide better services, better dockets in a lot of those, but also try to get pro people judges elected who kind of have an actual idea of what people are going through, how the system can impact, someone not just based upon the decision that's being rendered by that court, but on, how they're processed, the timeline and how quickly a case gets handled, or is it getting, drug out over a long period, and there's incarceration involved with that too. We're starting to look at and train a lot of the people in our pipeline to those impacts. So, hopefully if they do go on and they decide to run and they get elected, that, we can kind of change the pathways of justice across the state.
That's really awesome. The work that you all do, I know I work with Eddie a little bit, but it's really, really awesome work. So if there are folks on the call who are based in Ohio or know folks in Ohio, I would definitely recommend you all check out Buckeye Justice Forum. Earlier, I mentioned how there's just like more and more buzz surrounding state courts. And Kadida, you mentioning how, at least in this past election, the way that candidates were even engaging with hot button issues like abortion, have kind of changed some of the landscape in a way. I'm curious to hear from you all, just your thoughts about, one, how can we keep up this momentum surrounding state courts and not just let it be a, we're talking about this right now thing until we're all focused back on the Supreme Court or federal courts, but also how do you all see, if at all, just the landscape around state courts shifting in the ways that, judges or prospective judges are engaging with the process? I know, it was a mouthful.
I don't mind jumping in real fast. I think in terms of keeping attention, I think you don't really need to go far within many states to find, shortcomings within the justice system and horrible impacts on populations that appear in front of it. I hope that this moment, besides just looking to the courts to provide increased protections on the things that maybe the federal courts are failing to give us protections on, that we should draw attention to kind of the day-to-day plight of people who come before these systems and how oftentimes the justice system traps people, in perpetuity attached to these systems. So I think that we can use this moment to not only hail and praise the state courts for some of the work they're doing to protect rights, but, then draw it to, we have the judges who are also doing so many of these great things. The system that they are a part of is failing, I think, in so many ways. And in a brighter note, I think Vasu said it best earlier. In a lot of ways, state constitutions can actually provide more protections than the federal constitution can. And so I hope, kind of as an academic or a thought experiment, there are people looking at what does our state constitution say, and something that may not be feasible, a protection or maybe a harder path within federal court, it can happen within state court if you have the right conditions for it. If you have people who are willing to take a, more assertive interpretation and provide those protections. So, the spotlight is certainly on state courts right now. And I think, there's a few different ways that we really should navigate some narrative and attention so that we really can roll up our sleeves and, make a better system, better decisions moving forward.
And I'll jump in here and say that, as a swing state, as a state that was very important to the 2020 election, I don't think conversation around state courts is going away. We had a lot of activity here as Pennsylvanians around election law and around determining whose vote should count and whose vote should not count. And I think that for the better of all that activity, I think that means that we have a Commonwealth now that cares about our state courts and is more engaged in what it is they do and will stay engaged in what it is that they do. It was appellate courts here in Pennsylvania that determined whether or not provisional ballots counted in 2020. It will likely be Pennsylvania state courts to determine whether or not ballots count here in 2024, and that we're having free and fair elections here in this nation, and particularly in the Commonwealth for us. It was appellate courts to determine whether or not additional barriers to voting was a thing in terms of voter ID, more restrictive voter ID. And so I think that the conversation around, will we continue to talk about state courts? I think we'll always talk about state courts moving forward here in Pennsylvania. And people are starting to realize how important they are. And we're encouraged by the turnout numbers in terms of our elections, for those who are casting ballots to vote in state elections for the judiciary. And as we continue to see ourselves represented in these courts, that also will help in ensuring that we care about them more and engage in them more, and wanting to see the numbers improve from where they currently are in terms of a representative democracy. So I think that, if anything great really came out of 2020, one of those things being people are really paying attention to what's happening in our state courts.
I just wanted to piggyback on Kadida's point real quick. As someone from Georgia, also kind of one of the ground zeros for election disinformation and a swingy state at this point. Our state courts are where the big Trump case is being heard right now. And I think something that we all can do when there's an opportunity like that, even if it comes due to disinformation and things like the big lie, we can work into stories with the media. Like, this is why state courts are so important. Here's how this person who's presiding over this important case, here's how that person got there. If we make sure state courts are in the narrative for these bigger stories, I think people will see how important they are.
Yeah, for C3 purposes, I won't talk much about my home state of Florida, where I am based. But I think, all of you have just really hit on some really great points as it pertains to just messaging and framing. Vasu, I think earlier you were the one who even just gave the statistic about 95% of litigation coming through state courts. I don't think most lay people know that. I don't think a lot of lawyers maybe even know that. And so I think just making this a part of the everyday conversation, things that feel very common sense to a lot of us as advocates, but information and data that just may not be widely spread with people who are not steeped in this work every day that we are. It looks like I'm frozen, but maybe I'm back. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Love Zoom. Gonna try to turn my camera back on. Hopefully I don't freeze again. But also just wanted to add to that point, just how I think important and underestimated it is to make some of those issues just feel really real for people who have to seek some type of reprieve through their judiciary system in their respective states. Just knowing how, through state courts, a lot of the disputes that surround issues like housing, landlord-tenant law, disputes that you may have with your workplace and your employer, these are not necessarily cases that are always the big cases we see coming through federal courts. And so, I think just kind of continuing to drive home just that connection to make it feel real for people is something that, is really important for us as advocates to continue to do. But just want to pivot to getting back to encouraging people on the call specifically, or people on the call who know people who are not on the call, who you think may be wonderful judges. Just for those folks who are on the call who are law students, but also even those who have started in their career, what are just some useful things and tips they should keep in mind on their quest to become judges? Anyone is welcome to start.
Let me be a little corny for a moment here. When you see it, you can achieve it, right? And so for someone whose name is Kadida, to see a woman named Ketanji become a United States Supreme Court justice, that matters. And so folks who are joining this call today, younger in their career, younger in life, I want you to know that this is possible for you. You may not check all of the boxes you think exist in order to become a judge, but you probably check enough of the boxes. And so you should pursue this, and don't let anybody poo-poo you when you want to, move on in your career and possibly take on something such as this. We need folks who believe in equal justice to sit on benches across the country. Public interest, those of you who believe that we should have fair funding in public schools, folks who believe that we should have easier access to the ballot, we need you to become judges and justices. And we need to see ourselves reflected in this system. It's so abstract, justice itself. And so if you are someone who can, help in this moment and making sure that people really do believe in our justice system, because there is a lack of faith currently as it continues to become more politicized, that the integrity is missing. And I just encourage you to not let someone say you can't do this. A lot of times people will say, I'm not going to vote for this candidate in a primary election. They're never going to win. Well, you're never gonna make the bucket you don't take. Right. So I encourage you to look further into this, get with the organizations like Buckeye Justice, who are working on pipelines, get your mentor involved in helping you move along. I've had conversation with state judges and talked about, you should consider becoming a federal judge, and I've talked to folks who are not attorneys and say, you should look at becoming a magisterial court judge in Pennsylvania. So sky's the limit. We see ourselves out here now, and you can do this.
So much of what Kadida says rings true to advice that I would give. I'll also use a corny phrase, eye on the prize. It really what it is, from the time you go into law school until you enter practice, you can get pulled a lot of different ways. But if you know that this is something that you want to do, work towards it. When I talk to so many state court judges, I talked to so many state court judges and attorneys who at some point wanted to be a state court judge. And honestly, the biggest difference between the two, a lot of times, is those who ended up on the bench, they had someone, basically a sitting judge, directly mentor them or pull them out of what they're doing and shake them by the shoulders and say, no imposter syndrome. You can do this, right? I've seen the colleagues that I work with, their own stories. We have expanded to do more law school programming with Buckeye Justice Forum to put sitting state court judges in front of law students to just show how sometimes boring their stories are to get to the bench. That it's just, they wanted to be a judge, they pursued it, they built their reputation and the experience needed to do it, and then they decided to run. And maybe it took some got in the first time, it took others a couple tries, but it just take it upon yourself if it is something that you want to do. The one piece that of advice I think that I have outside of that is get busy building experiences, firsthand experiences within the system. The best thing that you can do when talking to anyone about the courts and getting them to draw attention to the courts, tell them what's going on within the courthouse and what you have seen. Credentials and a resume can be great and it can be very impressive, but I would take the best story of firsthand experience of what people are witnessing within that courthouse and ways that they bent that moral arc of justice right in the right direction. I will take those over the credentials for a lot of this at any time, because again, people have very little idea of kind of what goes on within that courtroom. So use that, build those experiences, kind of live out the values that you have. And when it comes time, if you decide to run, those stories go a very long way.
I'll jump in to also speak out against imposter syndrome. Sometimes I call it fake noodle syndrome, because what do you call fake noodles? Impasta. We don't want fake noodles. We don't want impasta. You can definitely do it. Another thing I wanted to do is to plug another link. It's our Judge Interest Forum at afj.org/judgeinterest. If the moment you know that you're interested in becoming a judge, there are many groups to help you figure this out. I'll add my own slogan: knowledge is power. You figure out what the laws or requirements are in your state, and you will feel like you have that much more of a handle on what it takes. And then the moment you know that you have any bit of interest in this, contact the groups that are involved in this process, figure out what the rules and requirements are, and try to make a career roadmap to sort of figure out how to get there. And that career roadmap no longer needs to be, oh, I have to become a prosecutor if I want to become a state court judge, right? Or if I want to become a judge at all. There are many groups that have worked to change that. We are growing in numbers, we are growing in expertise, and you can be part of that momentum and sit on the bench.
Yeah, Vasu, you were going to take mine, but I will just say, to round it all off, is it's not too early to start thinking about it. It's not too early to start working toward it. I think to Vasu's point too about a lot of the advocacy that some organizations are doing behind the scenes, in an effort to diversify the electorate. We want to see younger judges on the bench. And so don't feel like because you are, just starting law school, about to graduate, or even early in your career, that this is nothing you have any business thinking about right now. I think, to the point about a lot of these connections and things happening behind the scenes, steeping yourself in your community. Obviously, it's important to do your job and do your job well wherever you decide to do that. But also making sure that you are invested in your community, whether it be through your personal and professional commitments. A lot of those groups, advocates, and organizations that you surround yourself or just support and invest your time and energy with will be happy to do the same for you when it's your time to step up to the plate and run, or or, be considered for an appointment. And so I just also want to reiterate, Vasu said it already, but please don't feel like you have to shift or transform your career roadmap or aspirations in an effort to become a judge. The path is currently being laid. I am confident that that path will continue to be laid over the next several years, where we are no longer talking about seeing professionally diverse and pro-people judges as the exception to the rule, but hopefully one that can be normalized within both our federal and state judiciaries. And so if you're coming into law school or you're starting your career and you're like, I don't want to do private practice, but I feel like I need to work at a white shoe firm to, even, be someone who's seriously considered for a judgeship, don't necessarily put yourself through the pain of doing that. Just do what you're passionate about, do it well, and there will be a space for you. So I see we have one question. The question being, will you be able to perhaps talk for a few minutes about strategies for appointive judiciary states? So if anybody wants to answer that question, I will let folks jump in. I'm kind of looking at you, Vasu. Don't want to volunteer you though, but also happy to add there as well. But I know you do some work on appointments.
Indeed. I mean, the first strategy is like figure out who are the powers that be in your state. So let's say it's a governor directly making an appointment that has to be confirmed by a state judiciary. Well, now you have two authorities that both need to agree in order to make something happen. I'll give you an example, like in Connecticut last year, there was an initial nominee for state Supreme Court that didn't end up getting through because the state legislature had reservations, and especially key figures within that state legislature. So that's the first thing you want to figure out, who are the powers that be who are responsible for the appointment. And then you want to figure out, who are the people who are influential with them. You want to make sure that you're making the case to those folks and you understand the timeline that they're on in order to actually make an appeal. And then, of course, contacting different groups, hopefully groups you might already be involved in, like local bar associations, local progressive groups, who could speak out on your behalf and make sure that someone is holding those powers that be accountable and letting them know that, hey, we're watching and we know that we need more professional and demographic diversity in state courts, especially state Supreme Courts. And if you go the wrong way here, you will be hearing from us. You may get some bad press. We will be annoying. And so making sure kind of you get everybody together who may support your candidacy, and then make that appeal to the powers that be in order to get that appointment. It's kind of that simple, but the devil's always in the details here in order to lay the groundwork for it to happen.
Yeah, I would also just add briefly, don't be discouraged if you are seeking out an appointment for a vacancy and you don't get it the first time. A lot of times with appointments, just getting your name on the list or just out there is really, really crucial to laying the groundwork for when another vacancy arises. And then folks are a little more familiar with your name. And so when you compound that with just kind of work you've done in terms of building up connections, your professional resume and other things, that is helpful. So don't be afraid to put your name in the hat, even if it feels premature. I think that is another strategy to just kind of keep in mind that folks can deploy, particularly in states with appointments, where it feels like you don't have a shot. Take that shot anyways. To whoever said, Kadida, it was the shots you don't take, or the shots you don't take, or something like that. But yeah, that is the one question we have. I don't know if other folks have any other questions from the audience, or if any of our panelists have any questions y'all want to ask, or any final thoughts you all want to share before I close us out. Hearing and seeing none, or Eddie, maybe.
I'll jump in real fast, just parting thoughts. There's a lot of impact that you can have through state court organizing, whether it be serving as a judge or raising awareness about it. There really is a cultural and societal energy to kind of examining some of these institutions and understanding the impacts that you've had. And like I said a few times, I know my colleagues have said something similar, is, there's not a lot of attention to this. It's an education first effort. Um, there's so much room for growth and impact within this space. By raising awareness with people of what is actually going on, and the changes that could be made within this institution to the everyday issues, again, that have so much energy within culture and society right now. So if this is something that is interesting to you, pursue it, push it, talk to others about it. You'll be shocked to see how many others join with you in this, and equally how many others you open their eyes to what this could be and what is happening right now. So keep pushing. That's always my advice. Keep pushing.
Thanks, Eddie. And I just realized that I did not introduce myself. So that is important. But for folks who are still here, hey, I'm Tristan Brown. I'm the Policy and Program Director at People's Parity Project, sharing that because I just shared, I thought I shared our link, but I will type it again for folks. But we are a nationwide network of mostly lawyers and law students organizing around a host of issues, including diversifying our federal and state judiciaries with more pro-people judges. And I'm sharing that because we have chapters across the country. We have law student chapters, but also lawyers chapters that we are heading up, and would love to have subsequent conversations with law students, but also lawyers who may be interested in starting chapters, joining chapters that we have already available in the states. But also, if you just want to have kind of some conversations with me or anyone from our staff or other organizers who are doing some of this work, we would be happy to do that with you all. So there's the link. Hopefully it works. But anyways, thanks for making the time, Vasu, Kadida, and Eddie, and joining me here today to have this conversation. I imagine there will be a lot more conversations like this over the coming years, but I'm happy that we're having them and happy to have had you all join us. And thanks to everyone else who attended this webinar this afternoon. Please take advantage of all the resources that have been shared. And if folks have questions, again, please feel free to follow up with us and let us know. But if nothing else, have a wonderful Wednesday and a great rest of the week. Thanks, everybody.